Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the 8th Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada. And we have with us Jacqueline O'Neill, who is the director of the Institute for Inclusive Security. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what this group is, because you're not only a member on the panel who puts this great conference together on a yearly basis, but also engaged in daily policy issues in Washington.
Great, thanks. So, as you mentioned, our organization is based in Washington, D.C., and our focus is on increasing the inclusion of women in peace and security processes around the world. And I also happen to be Canadian, grew up in Western Canada, and have a role on the agenda committee for the Halifax conference.
What are you're at this conference often, every time, and you're also a key participant in some of the discussion groups, the off-the-record discussion groups, but as well as on the on-the-record groups. Why? How does an increased role for women in these conferences? I mean, it was great to see an all-woman panel, for example, yesterday. In a field that's really overwhelmingly dominated by men, and maybe not for the better of it, right? So why is it important to get women involved in these jobs, both at senior levels, but also at a deck plate level, from having troops, for example, in combat roles and things like that?
Well, one of the themes of the conference has been the changing nature of warfare in a complex environment in which we're all operating. And so I think we can all agree that in order to be successful in achieving whatever goals we have in those environments, we need to bring to bear all of the resources available to us. And historically and traditionally, we've overlooked women's inclusion as one of the most valuable resources that we have for doing so. And so in an era when we're facing violent extremism, terrorism, all kinds of traditional and non-traditional threats, we really need to be thinking about the entirety of our toolkit, so to speak, and recognizing that women are both often affected differently by war and have a different impact on war. And so one of the most important things I think we can do in this conference is talk about the different ways that diverse perspectives inform our situation analysis, our understanding of our operating environments, and inform our responses so that we're making the most, enlightened decisions possible as we face really dramatic strategic choices.
From an investment standpoint, what are the kinds of international investments that have to be made in stability from your standpoint that gets you onto a path? General Allen talked about that a little bit, why investment, economic development, civil society are actually really keys to prevent you from getting to the point where you're actually dropping bombs on somebody. What are some of the ways that can do, that you can the best achieve that game internationally?
It's often cliche to talk about root causes of conflict, but we really do have to look at the entire environment that creates both dissatisfaction and then leads to violence often. And so there's an entire suite of things I think we need to do. The one that we focus on most specifically is women's inclusion in decision making. And that ranges from women's inclusion in decision making at local levels, where women are often mediators between warring factions, tribal groups, etc., to the really most senior levels. And we see significant impacts when that does happen. So right now, about half of all peace agreements fail within 5 years. We also know that the number of people who sign peace agreement, about 3% of them are women. So we have a really exclusive system for negotiating peace that often holds in a short term and not over a long term. And one of the reasons for that is that the people who are around the table are not necessarily representative of the broader community that's going to have to adopt and embrace that peace agreement. So what we find is when you have women around peace negotiation tables, for example, they raise things that go beyond things like power sharing or where borders are going to be demarcated, but to things like police powers or integrated education or food security or sexual violence, a range of topics that are of interest and really will profoundly determine citizenry's acceptance or rejection of a peace agreement, and also will lay a foundation for stability over the longer term. And so it's really in our best interest to ensure that we have as broad and representative a group as possible making those decisions, such that when it does come time for them to be implemented, they'll be enduring.
There's a sense in Western democracies that from a women's rights standpoint, things have been on the upturn and improving for a very long time. But you look at the situation globally. What's the global situation for women and their role in security?
It's not linear, is what I'd say. I think there's been some really significant progress in many ways. One of the markers that we use is something called the development of a national action plan on women, peace, and security. The United States has one. It was issued in 2011. Canada has one. Now there are about 63 countries in total that have them. But that doesn't mean that things are improving. And in some ways, any great movement or set of societal progress also, the more important and the more significant it becomes, the more backlash it receives. So I think in many places we're also seeing people recognizing the importance and influence of women and then resisting that. And something that I've talked a lot about at the conference is the extent to which we, as a NATO allies, Western community, et cetera, need to recognize the importance of women's inclusion, in part because our adversaries are already doing it. So if you look at ISIS recruitment online, for example, the targeting of women online, specifically customized, women's creating social media campaigns targeted at other women, somewhere around 1 in 7 foreign fighters from so-called Western countries are female. They're going abroad and they're, engaging in the fight. ISIS is already recognizing women's agency, women's influence, women's power. They're not overlooking them. So we do so at our peril. Another example I often cite is Colombia. Colombia is about to undergo, hopefully, a large demobilization program. There'll be reintegration of the majority of FARC fighters back into communities. 40% of FARC fighters are females, and many of them have led battalions. They've been commanders of troops. They've been intelligence officers, signal operators, radio operators, medics, etc. And in traditional DDR programs, often they end up being told, you can become a hairdresser, you can become a seamstress, etc. And so we're not recognizing the role that women are already playing. And in doing so, we're actually making both them vulnerable, but we're saying narco traffickers, for example, here's a large population of people who have the skills that you need and that you want. They know the terrain, they know how to navigate complex institutions, et cetera, and they will be targeting them. So it's really at our peril that we overlook this resource that we have.
It's a little bit like the Iraq problem, right? You don't want to put a lot of highly trained people on the streets and assume that it's going to actually work out well for you. There is a concern by women a little bit in terms of the change in administrations. From your standpoint, how does that affect what you're trying to do, and what are some of the messages you're trying to deliver to the new administration?
Historically, this issue of women's inclusion in decision-making about peace and security has been bipartisan in the U.S. So the House just passed what's called the Women, Peace and Security Act. There's been progress under the Bush administration and then under the Obama administration. So my hope is very much that this will continue to be something that's not perceived as ideological, but very much necessity-driven and operational effectiveness-driven. So we're very much wanting to keep the discussion focused on the reasons why it strengthens all of our institutions to have women included and not at a more political level.
Jackie, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.